I think the notorious one in the US, I'm not a full-time wheelchair user, but I know that people who are full-time wheelchair users and who fly with their wheelchair do complain about Delta an awful lot. And that seems to be statistically the one that breaks wheelchairs over and over again and doesn't offer a compensation for it. If you are traveling through London Heathrow, and especially if you're on British Airways, maybe have a backup plan because you may well be left in the lounge. And if you ask for additional help, probably you're not going to get it, which is very frustrating.
Hey there, points people. You just heard a clip from Dr. Sally Riggs from Dr. Sally Riggs. Sally is a British psychologist who caught the travel bug young and has visited more than 50 countries. Despite long-term health issues such as chronic fatigue syndrome from COVID in 2020, she has been using points and miles to make traveling with health and disability issues more accessible. In this episode, expect to hear about why a disability should not keep you from traveling, what type of assistance passengers with disabilities can expect from airlines or hotels, and how to make sure you're getting those accommodations, strategies for earning points with medical expenses, and so much more. If you have large medical expenses, consider the Capital One Venture Rewards credit card. This card earns 2 points per dollar on all purchases, and points can be earned and transferred to several different airline and hotel partners. Remember, if you decide to apply for the Capital One Venture Rewards credit card or any other card, never apply directly through Google. Always use a friend or creator's referral link. And if you are interested in supporting this show when you apply for your next card, check out geobreezetravel.com/cards. And if you're not sure what card is right for you, I offer free credit card consultations at geobreezetravel.com/consultations. And we have links to the Capital One Venture Rewards credit card and the free consultation form for you in the show notes as well. And now, on with the show. Welcome to the GeoBreeze Travel Podcast, a show for anyone wanting to level up their travel hacking lifestyle. I'm your host, Julia Menez. I'm a travel hacker, coach, speaker, Filipino-American ENTJ who loves solid travel gear and using shortcuts on spreadsheets. On this show, I'm on a mission to bring you travel hackers from all walks of life to help you level up your travel hacking game. We dive into credit cards, miles, points, strategy, mindset, and the secrets behind how to travel the world for next to no cost. So, let's get hacking. Are you tired of missing out on amazing flight deals? It's time to change that. If you haven't heard of Thrifty Traveler, they are an email subscription service that brings the world's best flight deals straight to your inbox. These can be cash or points deals, and they deliver multiple emails a day. I actually have an entire Gmail folder just for Thrifty Traveler deals. Some recent email deals include business class flights to Australia and New Zealand for only 50,000 points, flights to Europe for 24,000 points round trip and economy, and flights to Costa Rica for $395 instead of the usual $700. These deals never last long, so sign up today at thriftytraveler.com and use the code GEO10, that's GEO10, to save $10 off of the annual subscription. Thank you to Thrifty Traveler for partnering with this episode of the GeoBreeze Travel Podcast. Hey, Sally, welcome to the GeoBreeze Travel Podcast.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's fantastic to be here.
I am so excited to have you here and to discuss a very needed topic that I don't think we've discussed on the podcast before, which is if you are traveling with disabilities, what are the best ways to navigate that and how can the world of points and miles also help? But before we jump into all of that, tell us a little bit about you and your background and how did you get into points and miles?
Yes. So I've been traveling. Goodness, I was fortunate enough to grow up in the UK where travel is much more regular. So I think Portugal was the first place I went to, maybe 18 months old before my other siblings were born. I have vague memories of being in places that weren't my regular house, and my parents tell me now that we were probably on vacation. We used to vacation a lot in Europe when I was little, Portugal, Spain, places like that that you can super easily get to with those cheap charter flights. and vacation deals that you can get in the UK. And I don't know at what point I realized that travel was important to me, but as a teenager, it was definitely something I was planning to do a lot of between school and college, and then between college and grad school. I've lived in a few other different countries now. I live in the US, but I've also lived in Japan. I lived in Israel for a little while. So it's been a big part of who I am for a long time. And the points and miles thing, I think, like many people, I was starting to dabble a little bit, reading some blogs, trying to figure out how to do it. Embarrassingly awful redemptions that I wasted my points on, and using the portal and not knowing about transferable points and all those fun things, really right up until the pandemic. And then when I got sick and I started to live with disability, and all my family are back in the UK. So that first December 2020, I still flew back there, even though things were very much kind of limited for travel. And kind of baptism by fire, I got to the airport and realized I couldn't do it anymore. And I needed to suddenly start learning about disability and disability travel. And as I started to recover from my illness, the points and miles thing just became so much more apparent that it would be helpful. And so I joined some programs and really got some proper education. And the last couple of years, I have done a lot of travel, which is feels really fun and exciting for me. Some of it has involved just getting to a hotel and then lying down for a couple of days. The ability to fly in business and first makes such a difference when you're dealing with certain impairments, that it's becoming like, this is going to be normal for me. This is what I'm going to need to keep doing. And then more and more people start asking me about, well, how do you do that?
For sure. Let's talk about the hotels thing real quick. So, what are
Yeah.
some common challenges that individuals with disabilities face when traveling by air or staying in hotels? And have you found any particular hotel programs that are pretty effective in addressing these challenges, knowing full well that there's a whole range of disabilities because cognitive impairment versus vision impaired versus wheelchair are all a little bit different. So, can you talk about firsthand which ones you've found to be most effective in addressing these, and then other resources for other people who might have different types of disabilities as well?
You hit the nail on the head with disability, that it definitely is a very diverse category. What I need assistance with, what someone else need assistance with, is going to be quite different. And so what we definitely need from a hotel program is people who are willing to ask, what do you need? What can I help with? How can I be of assistance? And what I really find is that this is where hotel status really comes into its own. Because if you have status with a hotel, especially if you have high status, you are much more likely to be asked, what do you need? How can I be of assistance? And interestingly, hotel staff are also much more likely to be willing to make accommodations for you. For example, I was down in Texas in February, and I had booked to stay at the Hyatt Regency in downtown Houston. And because it's downtown Houston, they have valet parking, but the self park is a totally different parking garage, and it's not connected to the hotel. Usually you have two options, one for valet, one for self park. One of the disabilities that I live with, I cannot utilize valet parking because I cannot have someone else sitting in my car breathing out when I might then contract something that puts me in the hospital from the air that they've exhaled. Although I would have been eligible for free valet parking because I have Hyatt Globalist, I couldn't use the valet. And the self park, you would have to pay for separately. It was going to be miles down the road. Then I'd have to walk back. I can't walk a long distance. So I messaged the hotel ahead of time and I said, listen, I'm globalist. I'm going to be staying for a week. I can't use valet parking because I have a disability. Is there any option that you can give me that allows me to park on property because I can't walk very far, but someone isn't going to be breathing in my car? And they went away, they discussed it, they came back to me and they said, you know what, we have a bunch of spots on the forecourt that you can just leave your car right there. We'll let the valet team know. We'll let everybody at reception know. You're going to be parking here. No one else is going to drive your car. And then you only have to walk a few steps to the door. And my hunch is that if I had just been a regular guest who did not have Globalist, they wouldn't have given me the time of day because it's not in their interest to bend over backwards and be super nice. Because I was Globalist, they made that exception. They also showed up at reception with masks on. Whenever they would bring anything to my room for room service, they would put a mask on. I didn't ask them to do that, but they were taking into account what I had said and being very thoughtful about my disability and accommodations that I might need. And I find that a lot. So I typically recommend to people, and people will say to me, oh, but if I have a disability, shouldn't I stay at an Airbnb? Because then I have more autonomy over what I'm doing. I can cook my own food. I can do this. I can do that. And personally, that doesn't work for my disability because sometimes I do need people to do stuff for me. And at an Airbnb, you don't have anybody. There's no one you can call, there's nobody there. So I do have Hyatt Globalist, and this year I'm at 59 nights already this year, so I think I'm going to be fine to maintain my 60. I do have from credit cards pretty much for the other main programs, but because they're not quite such high status, I tend to not stay with them as much because maybe they won't be quite so helpful in assisting me, but at least it gives me something. I do find actually that IHG, that I don't stay with that often, I have Platinum Elite from a credit card with them, and they're always super nice to me and super accommodating. That is my strategy, that having that higher status, you know that they are going to be asking, what can I do? How can I help? And it just makes a big difference to then whatever it is that you need. So there was actually, I think it's a Hyatt Place. I sometimes get confused between the Place and the house brand. I think it was a Hyatt Place also in Houston, where they were making a lot of noise across the hall from me. And I cannot move rooms once I have checked into a hotel because I don't have a lot of strength to put all my stuff back into my bag and move. And I always let them know on front desk when I'm checking in, by the way, I won't be able to move. Are you sure this room is okay? When I go in, I double check it before I unpack anything. And this room was fine, but 9 o'clock the following morning, it wasn't fine because they were drilling. And the hotel manager was very rude, very disrespectful. I did then get on the phone to Hyatt, and they found me another hotel nearby that I could move to. And they also negotiated a rate for me, which I thought was really kind. And again, I don't think they would have done that if I didn't have Globalists with them. Yeah, I do tend to recommend the more full service hotels because again, you're going to get that better service and more willing to accommodate disabilities. Legally in America, everybody should be accommodating every disability, and to have somebody stand and say, no, I'm not going to accommodate your disability, there should be some fallout to that, but unfortunately sometimes it does happen.
For everybody who's listening to this and they're like, I cannot afford the higher end hotels and I can't really afford business class flights and all of that, which we'll get into because, as we know, there's quite a bit of intersection between people who have disabilities and people who are not that financially privileged. Do you have any advice for those people other than stay at the nicer hotels, which do tend to be a little bit more expensive, either with points or with money?
I'm using my points. I don't have a ton of cash, and I can completely empathize. We all have a lot of medical bills that we spend our money on. And the thing about medical bills is that you can primarily pay them with a credit card. So if you are strategizing correctly and using a card that's going to get you 2 times points at least, then when you're paying your medical bills, you are then contributing to future hotel stays or future flights that are then going to be more comfortable for you. I certainly am not in a position where the kinds of hotels that I stay in, I am paying cash for them. And that's why the points and miles come into their own. I think it opens up opportunities for us that historically you might have looked at and thought that's not my socioeconomic status. And certainly living with this type of impairment, I have to pay a lot of money for this, I have to pay a lot of money for that. I can't afford those hotels. And we actually can if we're strategizing correctly with our credit card spend. And I think also, and I know you talk about this a lot, it's not encouraging people to spend money they don't have and buy things they don't need in order to get those points. It's about really maximizing the spend that you have and making sure that it's never on a card that is for cash back or for 1%, and that you're always getting 2 times, if not more, on what you do need to buy. There are all kinds of stores that you can go through the multipliers and still get the medical things that you need and wind up with all the points that you also need.
Fantastic. Let's talk about
Yeah.
flights a little bit, because you mentioned with the valet parking, it's very difficult if somebody's breathing in the same air as you, because with your disability, you can easily contract something that way. So you kind of need a pod. How has your experience been with airports, which are notoriously crowded anyway? They're generally crowded. If you're flying domestic, even domestic first class, you're going to have somebody else in your space. How does one navigate that with the type of disability that you have, where it's pretty compromising to be in close quarters with other people because of the immune
Yeah.
system and everything else?
So I have a lot of things that I bring with me and that help me manage that infection risk. You've met me in real life, and in real life, I wear a mask 24/7, a high quality mask that I have had tested so that the air is not leaking around the edge. I also use things like nasal sprays, oral probiotics, or a mouthwash, which we now have some beautiful evidence on how they reduce infection risk, because that's where infection is getting in, right? In your mouth, in your nose, and in your eyes. And I also carry a portable HEPA filter. So when I'm on the airplane, if I do need to eat and drink something, which with my illness I do have to do fairly carefully and frequently, you can get masks that have a valve in them that you can just put a straw in, and that still has a seal. So if you are somebody who doesn't need to eat and drink frequently, you can get away with not taking your mask off on a flight. I do have to take mine off, but I always have the HEPA filter right there. And touch wood, so far, I have been fortunate. I haven't contracted anything, and I do quite a few flights. So that's how I'm managing it with those additional mitigation risks. At the airport, unless it's like a super busy Friday night and you end up in a lounge where it's like you're shoulder to shoulder with people, which once in a while will happen. Usually I find in the lounge you can find a quiet corner. And internationally, I've even had lounges say to me, "Do you need a private room?" and give me a private room, which is lovely. They're looking at the disability, they're asking about, "What do you need?" And yes, please, I will take a private room if you have one, for sure. So airports, if you do have lounge access, and again, that's one of the benefits of using points and miles and flying further forward in the plane, that typically you do have that access. It is generally going to be a bit more space. I do carry also a CO2 monitor, carbon dioxide monitor, which we don't have a way of reading what bacteria or viruses are in the air at the minute that you can purchase cost effectively. But if there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the air, it means a lot of people have been breathing out, and so the risk is pretty high. And so you can buy these monitors for about $150, and you can tell if the air is super, super concentrated, this is probably not a safe spot, and move around in the airport till you find a place with a lower number, and that's probably safer. On the airplane, those monitors don't really work because of altitude and the way that airplanes air recycling works. The numbers are just totally skewy. But in the airport, that's a really useful way of checking. And I do that at conferences too, right? If I'm at a conference and they're serving food, probably right by the food is going to be super high concentration of CO2. But if I go someplace else, by the door or even step outside, it'll be lower.
What airlines have you found to be particularly accommodating or not as accommodating for your disability or some other people in the disability community where they've shared their experiences as well?
I think the notorious one in the US, I'm not a full-time wheelchair user, but I know that people who are full-time wheelchair users and who fly with their wheelchair do complain about Delta an awful lot. And that seems to be statistically the one that breaks wheelchairs over and over again and doesn't offer compensation for it. I do use wheelchair assistance at the airport because it's such a big space, and because of some of the issues I have. If I didn't do that, I'd probably be very symptomatic the first day of my vacation. And there's a very interesting relationship between wheelchair assistance and the airlines, because technically it's provided by a third party ground staff in the airport that you're traveling through, but you have to book it through the airline, and the airline has responsibility for them showing up. And London Heathrow and British Airways at London Heathrow are absolutely atrocious for wheelchair support. And I have been left in the lounge so many times and almost missed my flight. And you go to the service desk for British Airways and say, hey, my wheelchair isn't here. They roll their eyes, they do nothing. So that is one that I do tell people: if you are traveling through London Heathrow, and especially if you're on British Airways, maybe have a backup plan, because you may well be left in the lounge. And if you ask for additional help, probably you're not going to get it, which is very frustrating.
I can imagine that is extremely frustrating, especially at least with British Airways. Everybody's still speaking English, but you also travel quite a bit internationally to some countries where English is not the primary language. How
Yeah,
has your experience been when going to other countries, and if you can name some of the ones that you've been to, with
yeah.
disability accommodation, and how does one get around that, especially if you're traveling somewhere where it's all cobblestone streets, if you are a part-time wheelchair user or anything like that?
You learn very quickly which countries are paying attention to disabilities. And even just in Western Europe, where technically you would think that disability laws would be as good as the US, you get out of the train station or the airport and you're on cobblestones immediately. Can you find an elevator? Can you find a ramp? Very often, no. Traveling through the airport in Greece, I have used wheelchair assistance in Corfu. I was flying to another one of the Greek islands. It was okay, but it wasn't great. I think a lot of the international airports I've been through in the last couple of years, maybe English isn't their first language, but they do a lot of English speaking in the airport. I was recently in Oman, in Qatar, in Dubai. All of those countries were pretty good. In Dubai, there's a universal symbol for disability support, which is a sunflower. And they did have that sign up frequently throughout the airport. Although, interestingly, when the guy asked me to just take off my mask and sit there for 10 minutes, and I said, oh, no, I need to put it back on again. I'm so sorry. And he understandably was a little bit annoyed that I was not sitting there without my mask. He did ask me to then be taken to a different room, and that guy was very thoughtful and accommodating when I explained that I couldn't just take my mask off and sit there for an unspecified period of time, breathing in the germs that were around me. I think with hindsight, in a Arabic country, should I have made a fuss? But I mean, you learn to advocate for your disability, and ultimately you do have to ask for what you need. I think my favorite country so far of all the trips that I've done since living with disability has been Japan. I'm fortunate enough that I do still speak a little bit of Japanese from when I lived there, although probably not sufficient to explain my disability in great depth. But I was flying back from there on JAL, and they have a dedicated check-in area for people with disabilities, and they have low counter desks with chairs, which for me, any check-in that has a sit-down desk and a chair is absolutely beautiful. They also had those in Qatar at the first class wing for check-in, and for me, that's such a big deal because I could not stand for long periods of time, and sitting down to check in is just fantastic. But they also very thoughtfully said, can you tell us a bit more details about your disability? What can you do? What can you not do? What do we need to assist you with? And then we're at great pains to make sure that things like lifting my bags up into the overhead locker someone else took care of for me, which was enormously appreciated. I would imagine, because I think both JAL and ANA are relatively similar in terms of their service level, that you would get similar service from ANA. when passing through Japan. I know that's a super popular destination at the minute. Also, I did not utilize disability services in Disney in Japan, but I know that they are very good. And I have seen a few other folks passing through there recently on Instagram who have kids with disabilities and have used those disabled services. And my hunch is that Japan, if you're asking for assistance, certainly I've seen it on the train. People have disability assistance on the train, and obviously the politeness and the service orientedness is a part of Japanese culture and is taken very seriously.
As far as pre-planning goes, if somebody is like, okay, I have a disability, I haven't traveled much before, what do you need to fill out? Who do you need to contact before getting to the airport, before getting to your hotel, to let them know of what accommodations you might need, especially if in your situation you have a disability where it's not necessarily easily explained by just a word saying like blind or wheelchair or
Yeah.
cognitive impairment, anything like that. What do you do to prepare?
I definitely always book wheelchair assistance ahead of time. And ideally, you want to do that at the same time you book your flight. And usually, you can do it if you're booking in the app or even if you're booking on the desktop in the booking process, just like you can put in your TK ID or you can put in your frequent flyer number. There's usually a spot that you can request. It's either called special assistance or mobility assistance, disability assistance, something like that. So poke around in the booking process. You can usually find it and you can request that ahead of time. For wheelchair at the airport, they have a number of options. So again, depending on your mobility level, I request the one where I cannot do the stairs and they are going to wheel me right to the door of the plane. But I pretty much can manage from the door of the plane to my seat as long as somebody can help me with my bags. You might need assistance to your seat, in which case you can request that. You might be fine to the gate and you can do the jet bridge, in which case you can request that option. In terms of hotels, usually I am emailing ahead of time, and most hotels do send you a kind of welcome email these days. So I'm just replying to that email and asking for what I need. If it is a hotel that hasn't sent me a welcome email, then usually I just message directly to my Hyatt concierge just to say, can I get the contact for this hotel I'm going to? And they usually give me one of those front desk emails. The onus is on us to think ahead and to think about what it is that we might need and not be afraid to request it. And at the end of the day, if you forget, if you don't think about it, or if something happens last minute, I think I have been pleasantly surprised. If I have to request something last minute, then people can be reasonably accommodating, again, depending where you are.
What are some of your tips for people where they haven't traveled too much and they might have a disability where it's not quite so visually apparent? If it's something more like an anxiety disorder or something like yours where you can't really look at you and be like, oh, you have an immune disorder where you can't breathe in the same air as somebody else in close quarters because of the increased risk of infection. When there are always people who hear those kinds of things and they're like, it's all in your head, Sally, like it's not a real thing. And they might be less accommodating, especially in tight, cramped spaces like airports, airplanes, there's a line at the hotel, something like that. What's your advice for dealing with those situations for people who have disabilities where it might not be readily apparent that I do need some additional services? I'm not just making this up to skip the line. What's your advice there?
When I'm traveling, and I don't have it on today, but I do have a sunflower disability identifier. I wear the wrist one, but you can get lanyards or other kinds of versions. And I do highly recommend those. They're not as widely understood and recognized in the US, but internationally, they definitely are. If you're in the UK, if you're in Europe, like I said, in Dubai, it was recognized because there will be times that you have to flash it to make people wake up and pay attention. And I would say, firstly, don't be afraid to advocate for yourself because people don't know, and it isn't necessarily their job to know what you need if you don't let them know. But equally, travel is a service oriented industry, and people are very happy to help if you let them know what you need. So I remember when I first was beginning to kind of get to grips with the fact that I had a disability, it's an adjustment and you don't want to ask and you don't want to be a bother and all of those things. But slowly over time, you learn and you become a little bit more assertive and a little bit more of an advocate. And and now I'm not afraid just to say, hey, I'm so sorry, I can't stand in this line. I'm going to sit down over here. And if somebody makes a fuss, then I'm just going to flash my sunflower and be like, yep, I have proof that I have a disability. And the times where, and unfortunately it does happen, I have had particularly wheelchair attendants who are not disability sensitive, and they look at me and they think that I'm young and I don't have a disability. Supposedly I look perfectly healthy. And so then they decide to maneuver the wheelchair in a way that is uncomfortable or disrespectful. Or I even had one woman who literally screamed in my face, "You don't have a disability, you're just making it up." I am not afraid to report those people because they shouldn't be doing that job. And certainly, if somebody else more vulnerable was going to need assistance and couldn't stick up for themselves, they would be grateful that I had advocated on their behalf. And then maybe that person is not there on that day assisting them. So definitely don't be afraid to ask for what you need, and also don't be afraid to flash a sunflower lanyard or any other kind of disability identifier, because sometimes people just do need that little wake up moment and they forget that disabilities can be hidden and that anybody, regardless of how they look, can be dealing with a disability like, for example, anxiety or autism or any of the other hidden disabilities that people live with on a daily basis.
The sunflower thing is not as common in the United States. Like you
Yeah.
mentioned, any tips for if you're traveling mostly domestically within the United States and you're like, I have the sunflower, people are like, I don't know what that means.
I think in the US, I would just say something like, I live with chronic illness and disability. And saying that word disability, obviously, then America is more litigation focused. And so then I might follow it up with, and so I'm protected under ADA. And so therefore I'm going to need, and then I list what I need. Because I think in America, that's what people are more afraid of. You're in their hotel and you're going to file a lawsuit because they didn't give you your accommodations. If you go to the ADA website, there's a link through to the Department of Justice, which is where you report ADA violations. It's a very easy form to fill out, and people are understandably afraid that you're going to do that. It is okay to say, I'm protected by ADA, and therefore I'm going to need, and usually then people are like, oh goodness, yes, I didn't realize, let me get that for you. And I think that's sort of the equivalent of flashing your sunflower lanyard is, yeah. In America, people are much more likely to mention lawsuits. If you mention lawsuits in Europe, people are like, I don't even know what that means. And I don't really care.
Oh, such a difference in culture. I can definitely
Yeah.
understand that in America. People are always just like, I will sue you for blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, cool. Everybody understands the language of litigation in America. It's fun stuff. Any other tips that you'd like to share with everybody, whether it's for people who are traveling with disabilities, people who might be just interacting with other people traveling with disabilities? I don't know if we have a whole bunch of airline and hotel staff who listen to this podcast, but for them as well.
Yeah, I think also people frequently ask me in reference to friends or family members, right? I think the most common one is, I'm traveling with my parents and my parents have some mobility impairments. How do I help them out getting wheelchair assistance? Or how do I help them out getting the right kind of support in the hotel? I think the thing I would say is, especially if you are someone who lives with disability, and especially if you're someone who that has been newer in your life more recently, because obviously it's also the kind of thing that not all of us are born with and any of us can experience in our lifetime. Don't think that means that the kind of travel that you used to do is over and that you have to live a different quiet lifestyle now. I think travel disability advocates are very much a thing, and anybody is entitled to travel regardless of whether they have a disability or not. And it may just mean you have to ask for a few more things, but you are entitled to those things and you shouldn't be afraid to ask for them. And certainly for me, I think once you get into a little routine, I have my bag ready with all the things that I need when I travel, like my HEPA filter or my additional supports for my immune system. And then it just becomes a part of a habit of what you do. I check into my hotel room, I run the HEPA filter. I also have a UV light that I maybe flash around the room to make sure that the bacteria is getting killed. And then once I've established that that's a safe space, then I can take off my mask and I can have a lovely time in my hotel room. And once you get into those little habits, it does then become very easy and very enjoyable to get back to the things that you used to enjoy, maybe in a slightly different way. I'm navigating airports in a wheelchair now, which I never used to do, but I've done that a lot and I have a routine for it, and it's now relatively pleasant. So, yeah, that's what I would say if you're thinking about it. You definitely can. It may need a little bit of extra thought and planning, but with practice, it will become routine, and then the world is your oyster again.
For somebody who's thinking, okay, but worst case scenario, like you flash the UV light around your hotel room and you're like, I think we're good, but then something happens, whether it's for you an acute affection or for somebody else, like something just happens and you end up in a hospital or something in a foreign country. I think that's probably like the thing people fear most aside from death.
Yeah.
What are your suggestions for that? I don't know if that's ever happened to you where you're like, oh, it's infection time and I'm not near my usual doctors. What do you do in that situation?
Yeah, it hasn't happened. And I think that is partly because I do plan and I always travel with meds. I always travel with just in case meds that I wouldn't be able to get, in another country. So don't be afraid to pack things like that you might need. Definitely, you're going to want travel insurance. And the other place where points and miles credit cards become useful is a lot of the cards that we are typically using to get transferable points also come with the kind of insurances that are going to be very beneficial, including things like medical helicopters and other types of evacuations, so that if you do get sick, you don't have to go to the hospital in the country that you don't know and don't speak the language. You can get on the phone to Amex or whatever and very quickly be evacuated to your country of origin and go to your local doctors and your local team. So those are the things where it is always worth thinking ahead, just to make sure, what are the coverages I have? Do I have medical evacuation? Do I have coverages for any kinds of additional concierge services? Because a lot of those also will include, maybe somebody can bring you the meds if they're not available in that country. Some of those medical insurances, they will send someone who can bring you what you need. So just taking a little bit of time, doing a bit of extra planning, seeing what your coverages are, making sure you have the coverage that you are comfortable with for what you are dealing with. And then hopefully, if you do get caught short, you will still be taken care of.
Fantastic advice. And speaking of great advice, can you point our listeners to any other resources or accounts that you would recommend checking out for even more points and miles tips, especially for the disabled community?
I would say, in terms of accessible travel, and especially for folks who are non-ambulatory wheelchair users or full-time wheelchair users for whatever reason, Curb Free Corey Lee, he has his own blog, and he's also on Instagram and various other channels. He makes fantastic content for accessible travel, and particularly if you are going somewhere and you want to know, do they have accessible trails? Do they have accessible museums? Do they have whatever that is wheelchair accessible? He will have the content more than likely. He will have gone there, and you can see, which is what I love about the time that we're in right now. I've traveled my whole life before phones existed, before we had the internet, when you just would set off with your Lonely Planet guide with the crappy pencil and paper map. And nowadays, you can be in the middle of nowhere. You can get on those AI apps on WhatsApp or whatever it is, and you can look things up and you can literally see what it looks like on the ground. And that, again, is great for planning for disabilities, because you can see, can I roll from here to here, or will I be able to get this? And that makes such a huge difference for us traveling with disability.
Fantastic. And where can people find you on the internet if they have any more questions for you?
I'm at dr.sallyriggs on Instagram, and I do post a lot of content also about my illness. But whenever I'm traveling, I'm always storying about traveling with a disability and particularly how I do that on Points and Miles. So if you want to see some of the places that I've been in the last couple of years, those are all saved to my Save Stories. You can look and see all of the fun places that I've been.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Sally, for joining us today on the podcast. We learned so much, and these tips are going to be so helpful for so many people in the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the GeoBreeze Travel Podcast. If any of the cards mentioned in today's episode piqued your interest, please check out the links in the show notes for more information on any of the cards. Also, if you apply for a card using the links on that page, I may receive a commission too, so please and thank you. P.S. I hear the links work better in Internet Explorer or Safari, and sometimes the credit card applications tend to glitch out in Chrome. Additionally, it would mean the world to me if you could subscribe to this podcast, leave a 5-star review, and share it with a friend. And if you would like to make even more travel hacking friends, please sign up for the Patreon to access our monthly masterclass hangouts. We dive deep into a particular points program each month, and you'll get to ask all of your travel hacking questions and enjoy being around other people who enjoy points and miles just as much as you and I do. If you would like an invite to the next one, head over to geobreezetravel.com/hangouts to sign up to be on the invite list. Take care and happy travels!